Now that we have talked about the concept of a global mindset, I would like to devote some time to discussing the strategic perspective of doing business in emerging and frontier markets. As we just established in the prior discussion of global mindset, some of the approaches, engagements, and interactions that you would be using in frontier and emerging markets are going to be different from those that you would be used to in more developed markets. And as such, it is only logical to assume that your overall business model would need to be recalibrated and adjusted to fit the context of the emerging or frontier market that you are trying to enter. The first step in assessing the need for a business model adaptation or innovation would be to engage in broad-based environmental scanning and trying to get a solid grasp of the institutional realities, including institutional voids and formal versus informal institutional dynamics. Based on the resulting macro-level assessment, you would then be likely to choose one of three basic options that would be available to you. One scenario might lead you to conclude that in order to maximize your chances of capitalizing on the full market potential, you may, at a minimum, need to adapt and tweak your business model to fit the local context. The second option might be to hope that your overall activities and business approach and demonstration of operational efficiencies might just prove to be the catalyst for institutional reform and innovation in the country that you'd like to expand into. In a third instance, and based on your macro-level assessment and identification of institutional weaknesses, you may conclude that the risks of doing business in the particular market far outweigh the potential benefits, and as such, you will refrain from making a commitment to that market. Now, given the prevalence of diverse risk factors in emerging and frontier markets, it is not surprising to hear that despite having done due diligence and deployed effective risk management and mitigation factors, which subsequently supported a decision to expand into an emerging market, companies may at times have to reassess their business activities in light of emerging risk factors. An illustrative case in point here is the fallout from the 2021 military coup in Myanmar, which prompted some foreign investors to reassess their business ventures. In one instance, Japan's Kirin Holdings, in response to the military coup, announced the termination of its two joint ventures in Myanmar. As reported in a February 5, 2021 Nikkei Asia article, Kirin had released a statement stressing that the actions by the military were, quote, against our standards and human rights policy, end quote, and that, quote, we have no option but to terminate our current joint venture partnership with Myanmar Economic Holdings Public Company Limited. We will be taking steps as a matter of urgency to put this termination into effect, end quote. Prompting that move was at least in part the simple fact that the two joint venture partners in which Kirin held majority stakes, the Myanmar Brewery and the Mandalay Brewery, were co-owned with Myanmar Economic Holdings Public Company Limited, an entity that, as described in Nikkei Asia, serves as a welfare fund for Myanmar's military. And Kirin concluded that its broader corporate social responsibility commitments were no longer compatible in the aftermath of the military coup. As quoted in the Nikkei Asia story, Kirin said that, quote, we decided to invest in Myanmar in 2015, believing that through our business we could contribute positively to the people and the economy of the country as it entered an important period of democratization, end quote. And obviously, with the onset of the military coup, this was no longer a viable proposition. So as this story indicates, Kirin may well have made a conscious decision that the risk of investing in the frontier market of Myanmar was well worth it despite obvious institutional weaknesses. And in part, this assessment was supported by commitments from the Aung San Suu Kyi government for economic reform and market liberalization. What Kirin and numerous other observers, however, did not anticipate was the fact that the military, after losing a number of the few remaining seats that it held in Parliament as a result of a recent election, would not only dispute the results, but instead would go so far as to undo the election itself. Consequently, the level of political risk of doing business in Myanmar increased dramatically, as did the reputational risk of being associated with business entities connected directly to the military. And this is what prompted Japan's Kirin to ultimately pull the plug on its operations in Myanmar. At the start of this video, I made a reference to business model flexibility and adaptation. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the building blocks of a business model, so I want to briefly go through those various components because they are relevant whether you do business in an emerging or frontier market or in a developed market. In fact, careful analysis and evaluation of all of these components might alert you to broader risk factors in the markets that you are trying to enter. At the most basic level, of course, companies are drawn to an emerging or frontier market because of an actual or potential future customer base. Whether they produce products or provide services, the companies would also have to carefully assess the value proposition from a customer perspective. It goes without saying, of course, that any failure of compellingly articulating a value proposition will not yield a lucrative customer base. If there is a clear synergy between the company's value proposition and customer expectations, the company would have to start thinking about logistics. That is, the channels through which they will provide products and or services to the customers. At the same time, companies also need to start thinking about their approaches to building customer relationships. Impactful customer relationship management, of course, requires a solid understanding of the local conditions and, above all, sensitivity to customer expectations. The simple fact is that proven customer relationship management techniques do not necessarily translate easily from one culture to another. To put this into perspective, after having moved to the United States at the age of 19, I wholeheartedly embraced the customer is king mentality, as was demonstrated in many of my interactions with businesses in the US. But after moving to Asia, and especially as a result of the time I spent in South Korea, I quickly realized that Korean customer relationship management was much more sophisticated and truly customer-centric than anything I had ever experienced in the United States, or for that matter, in Europe. I also had similar experiences when comparing customer service on US and European airlines compared to Asian and Middle Eastern carriers. Across the board, customer service mentality on Singapore Airlines, Asiana Airlines, Korean Air, Emirates Airline, and Qatar Airways is in a league all of its own compared to the at times dismissive attitudes I experienced on US and European carriers. These examples go to show that genuine adaptation and commitment to local customer expectations is absolutely critical, and all the more so in emerging and frontier markets that are defined by heightened competition. And when the company makes a commitment to an emerging market, it generally does so with specific expectations concerning revenue streams, based on sophisticated modeling about the timing of a break-even point, the level of expected profitability, or over the course of a specified time frame, etc. Next, a company also needs to have a good sense of the key resources that it needs to commit to make emerging market expansion viable and profitable. At the same time, it also needs to identify the key activities and steps necessary to get the business venture off the ground. And related to that, a company also needs to think through and identify what, if any, key partners are needed to maximize the possibility of success. The identification and selection of key partners is especially critical if a company is required to work with local companies in a joint venture arrangement. The track record here is not always very encouraging, as you have seen, for example, in our prior Cambodia case study about Santan Manufacturing. The final, and indeed also a very critical component in any business plan, is obviously the overall operational cost structures. So collectively, these business model building blocks constitute the so-called business model canvas. And let me now illustrate each of those components in a little bit more detail on an individual level. And as I did a few minutes ago, let me start again with the customer segments. Whether a company is committing to expanding in a developed, emerging, or frontier market, the logical starting point is to ask who it will be creating value for. What is the most important customer segment that it wants to target? And this last question is particularly important because, as you would be reminded in any business analysis course, there generally are several types of customer segments that you can focus on. A company may, for example, structure its business model around the concept of the mass market. Now, in this case, there is no differentiation between different customer segments. If, on the other hand, a company embraces a niche market approach, it is effectively committing itself to servicing very specific and specialized customer segments, which in turn requires that the value propositions, the distribution channels, and the customer relationship building blocks of the business model canvas are clearly focused toward those specific segments. A third approach may focus on a segmented market approach, whereby you adapt your products and/or services to meet slight differences in customer needs and expectations. And a commitment to a diversified customer segment, on the other hand, adds a degree of complexity because the company is committing to serving customer segments that have very different needs and expectations. Turning now to the value proposition, I think we can all agree that this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and it largely determines whether a company achieves profitability. Through a distinctive value proposition, a company is effectively drawing on a combination of factors that help to make its products and the services meet the needs, expectations, and wants of the various customer segments. The newness factor essentially means that a company has succeeded in fulfilling a heretofore unmet need. Of the other relevant factors, some may include, of these relevant factors for newness, these may include improvements in performance, the ability to easily customize a product or service to meet the specific needs of individual customers or niche market segments. Design can also be a distinctive value proposition, especially if it helps to differentiate a product in a memorable way from those of its competitors. Price may be a value factor that is especially important in emerging and frontier markets, not least because you are unlikely to use the same pricing structure that you would have used in a developed market. At the same time, if a company can provide a similar product or service at a reduced price without compromising on quality and/or performance, it obviously will stand out from the rest of the crowd. Accessibility is another critical factor when it comes to crafting a value proposition. For emerging market customers, recall, for example, the heightened accessibility to mobile banking that was provided through basic and cheap cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa, which I had briefly mentioned in last week's lecture video. That same example also helps to illustrate the power of increased convenience or usability, because the comparatively easier access to mobile phones made it more convenient for people to engage in mobile banking, given the fact that many people in rural areas up to that point were largely unbanked and thus did not even have access to basic banking services. When it comes to distribution channels, a company can create its own distribution network or work with channel partners in the various markets it wants to establish a presence in. In this context, companies may always also want to engage in a comprehensive analysis of the risks of developing an in-house distribution network as opposed to relying on partners. Additionally, if a company decides to rely on a sales force, it probably will make sense to recruit locals, but it might also require additional training for those individuals to ensure that those locals adhere to corporate values and customer relationship standards that the company embraces. Alternatively, you may choose to build a business plan around web sales, in which case you need to have a clear understanding of the telecom and internet infrastructure in the emerging markets you want to expand into, because if the country has a very low internet penetration rate, for example, building a business model around web sales would be incompatible with the realities on the ground. And let me give you one very specific illustrative example in this context. The Chinese cell phone manufacturer Xiaomi, quite a few years ago, through its internationalization strategy, targeted frontier markets where the internet infrastructure was not nearly as developed as in China, even though its business model centered primarily around website sales. So obviously, in order to stand any chances of success, the company had to adapt its business model accordingly. Now, when it comes to customer relations, the company may decide between relying on personal or even dedicated personal assistance. And the latter here probably is more appropriate for high-value clientele, i.e. VIPs, very important people. Or on the other hand, a company can forgo direct customer relations by relying instead on self-service or automated services. And again, the choice here appears to be in part driven by local conditions, including potentially education levels, and when it comes to automated services, the internet penetration rates, the reliability of local power grids, etc. Co-creation, meanwhile, goes beyond a traditional customer-company interaction and essentially invites customers to submit product reviews and thus create value for other potential customers. When it comes to revenue streams, a company may decide to sell ownership rights to a physical product, adopt a fee structure based on the usage of services, sell access to service through subscription fees, charge fees in exchange for permission to use protected intellectual property, or even generate revenue through advertising particular products or services on the company's online platforms, etc. Now, shifting to key resources, a company needs to develop a clear understanding of what resources may be required to generate the value proposition that is needed to drive sales and thus also profitability in a specific market. The required resources may fall into several categories, including physical, intellectual, human, or financial resources. In other words, does a company, for example, have the requisite factory floor space, the manufacturing equipment, access to a workforce with requisite levels of education and/or experience, or even ready access to cash or access to lines of credit? Additionally, the company also needs to have a clear understanding of what specific activities are required to generate customer value, to build reliable and efficient distribution channels, to foster valuable customer relationships, and to generate revenue streams. Are those activities going to be centered mostly around production, around generating solutions to customer problems, or do the activities require specific platform or network structures? And can those be developed and sustained in an efficient manner in a specific emerging or frontier market? With regard to key partnerships, it is important to identify who the critical partners may be or need to be and what may be expected from these partners in terms of resources and/or activities. A company's decision to enter into partnership agreements may be based on the need to pool resources and/or establish a dominant market presence, i.e., a strategic alliance, or to preempt excessive competition. Alternatively, industry-specific laws and regulations may require the creation of a joint venture. Between 1994 and 2021, for example, foreign car manufacturers in China were required by law to engage in a 50-50 joint venture agreement with local car companies. It is only as of January 1st, 2022, that according to a document which was released by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce and the National Development and Reform Commission, foreign car companies are allowed full ownership of passenger car manufacturing sites. Up until this recent announcement, the only way a foreign car manufacturer could have a wholly foreign-owned operation in China was if 100% of the units produced were earmarked for exports, as was the case for a Honda factory in Guangdong province, which I had visited back in 2005. And finally, through buyer-supplier relationships, companies may also strive to optimize operational efficiency by reducing costs and sharing infrastructure, for example, and achieve economies of scale. Now, all this being said, it is important to keep in mind that entering into key partnerships in the emerging or frontier markets carries significant risks as well, especially in joint ventures where the parties may, as the saying goes, share the same bed but dream different dreams. Or simply put, the parties to a joint venture may have different motivations for engaging in the venture in the first place. Emerging or frontier market partners might well hope to benefit from technology transfer, for example. So in other words, there's always the very real risk that your partner of today might just become your competitor of tomorrow. And finally, as far as the cost structure is concerned, a company will need to determine the most important costs that are inherent to its business model. What key resources used in the business activities are the most expensive? In other words, cost considerations include both fixed and variable costs. And you also want to take into account the prospects of significant economies of scale, as that would convey a cost advantage over time. And related to that, what is the possibility of economies of scope? What is the possibility of supporting activities such as marketing activities or distribution channels being leveraged for the benefit of multiple products, thus leading to additional cost advantages? So in summary, these are some of the factors that businesses would have to take into account when considering doing business in emerging or frontier markets. And in many instances, simple business model adaptation, however, might not be enough. In fact, what may be needed is outright business model innovation, a reality that was compellingly illustrated in the 2 Harvard Business Review articles that are assigned for this week. The 2011 article on new business models in emerging markets, and the 2019 article on cracking frontier markets, as well as the Chodo-Cool, Little Cool, Big Opportunity case study that we will be discussing during our final synchronous class session. Indeed, the need for full-blown business model innovation might be the norm rather than the exception to help unlock latent business potential in emerging and frontier markets. This would especially appear unavoidable if a company is committed to fulfilling an unmet need because the customer value proposition, which in emerging and frontier markets is largely based around affordability and access, is likely to prove difficult to achieve by simple reliance on the company's existing business model. And what's more, For a company's product, we have to have inherent value proposition for emerging and frontier market customers. The product need not be extremely sophisticated, as will become readily apparent in this week's case study. To crack emerging and frontier markets, then, may in many cases require the development of entirely new products, rather than simply bringing a company's existing products to this new market. This is then where emerging market entrepreneurialism comes to life. You provide a product or a service that through affordability and access addresses specific needs and concerns of the local customer base. In the words of the late Clayton Christensen of Harvard Business School, to capture, you must first create. And again, this idea comes out powerfully in your assigned readings on cracking frontier markets. It is in those pages that Christensen champions the idea of what he calls market creating innovation. So to conclude this course then, emerging and frontier markets hold distinctive potential for companies that are willing to invest the time, energy, and money to first understand the situational realities in those markets and then position themselves to provide products and or services that offer tangible value propositions. The risks and challenges that these markets present can to a large degree be effectively managed or mitigated. But maximizing the inherent opportunities first and foremost requires an entrepreneurial attitude and mindset. Emerging and frontier markets should not and must not be simply viewed as yet another dumping ground for a company's current products, as a way of extending a product's life cycle, that is. Now, that being said, this might not always be altogether inappropriate, though, especially if a country may already have enough of a market segment that is blessed with disposable income levels necessary to be able to purchase a company's existing range of products. In most cases, however, the per capita income of the average person in emerging or frontier markets may not be anywhere close to the level where they could afford to buy a company's existing range of products, especially if those products were to remain priced at a developed market level. So in light of these realities, companies that are committed to expanding their visibility and presence in emerging and frontier markets would do well to first and foremost focus on developing products or services that speak to the immediate needs and wants of people, while at the same time presenting a compelling value proposition in terms of affordability, access, convenience, and usability, among others. And on this note, I want to conclude this course and thank you once again for your interest and attention. I hope that you were able to take away some valuable learning points from the lecture videos, the assigned readings, as well as the in-class case study discussions, and that the information presented might just have generated an increased interest in either a particular world region or a specific emerging and frontier market. I certainly enjoyed engaging with all of you over the last 6 weeks, and I look forward to reading your final papers. So again, thank you for your interest in this course, and I wish you all the best in your future studies.